Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canon Creative Studio here at the Sundance Film Festival. I'm going to be your moderator today for a discussion with Matthew Heineman on the extraordinarily important film, The First Wave. Matt, thank you for being here. Really appreciate the chance to have this discussion with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This
is probably the most emotionally devastating documentary I think that I've really ever seen. I was a mess from beginning to end, and I cannot imagine what it was like to be there to capture these moments. And for those of you who have not had a chance to see this, first of all, I think it's an extraordinarily important documentary that should be must view for everybody. But Matthew was out at the front lines capturing what was happening at a New York hospital as COVID was just taking over our country. And Matt, I'd love to ask, how did you start into this? I mean, when did you recognize that you were going to dive in and tell this story?
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate that. I think in March 2020, like everybody, I was just terrified by, what was potentially about to sweep across our country. And I felt this enormous obligation, urge to try to document it, to try to capture it. And, at that point, we're so inundated with stats, headlines, and misinformation around this. And, I just wanted to try to put a human face to it. And, we kept talking about these healthcare heroes, these doctors and nurses on the quote unquote front lines, but we weren't viscerally, emotionally connecting to their experience. And so I wanted to try to put audiences inside the hospital, inside their shoes, to try to at least, attempt to document this once in a lifetime pandemic.
So one of the interesting aspects of this is, typically when you watch a documentary, you're learning sort of at a distance of a subject that you might not have had access to before. I had the chance to do another Canon panel here at Sundance for the film Downfall, the case against Boeing, which, I got to learn about aeronautical technology and things that I would never really have known about prior to that. But here you're doing a documentary where everyone in the world was touched by COVID. But you're showing us a side that, well, luckily, many of us never had a chance to get to. But it, like you said, it puts a human side to this. How do you go about figuring out that that's the approach you're going to take to this?
That's sort of what I've done with all my films is trying to take these big amorphous subjects, whether it's, cartels in Mexico or ISIS in Syria or, human trafficking or the heroin epidemic. And try to, humanize it. And so, I didn't want to sort of reinvent the wheel with the style of filmmaking that I do. It's, it's generally character driven, observational verite filmmaking. And that's very much what I wanted to do here. I didn't want to do a polemic of sort of what went wrong or how do we, who's at fault, or, especially in those early weeks and early months, it was clear that this was becoming so politicized. And so that's not the filmmaker that I am, and that's not the film that I wanted to make. Other people were doing that, and we're surely being inundated with that on the news every single day. And so I wanted to try to find individual subjects that I could follow over the course of the trajectory of this virus. When I started, I had no idea, if I was gonna be filming for, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. I think we naively thought we were just gonna be filming for a couple of weeks. And obviously we ended up filming for months, and that, 2 years later, we're still living with it today.
How did you initially go about getting access into the hospital and to these patients, especially in a time of COVID when things were locked down so tightly?
Yeah, that was one of the hardest parts of this process was getting access. It always is. And, I think we reached out to basically almost every hospital system in the country and pretty much got no's at every hospital system across the country. And then finally, through a participant in a previous film that I made about healthcare called Escape Fire, was introduced to the head of the largest healthcare system in New York State, Northwell, And through that introduction began a path towards where we'd end up filming in Queens. And I owe so much to them for having the courage and the bravery to open their doors to us at such a incredibly scary and unknown time. But I think they felt like I felt like it was, there's a historical import to documenting this moment.
What it would kind of, not meaning to beat the subject, but what you were able to do was put such a personal and human touch from both the medical side and the patient side, which is something that we didn't get to see on the news. Like you said, all we're seeing is statistics and numbers and this many more cases and all the mandates and things closing down. But you were able to get in there and watch the process of both people who succumbed and passed to COVID and the doctors and nurses who were affected by that, and also the incredible success stories. It's a magical thing for a filmmaker to be able to get those stories, right? But how did you select these people? Did you shoot like a dozen patients and these are just the stories that you chose, or how do you go about that?
So I think a younger, less confident version of myself probably would have followed a lot more people in the film. But those who you see in the film, the doctors and nurses and patients that we followed, are really those who we invested in. There's maybe a couple more patients that we followed, somewhat in depth, but we really focused on Dr. Dujay, Kelly, Ahmed, Brussels, and Carl over the course of these 4 months. I really wanted to try to let audiences feel what it felt like to be a doctor or a nurse or a patient or a family member. And when we first started this, it was really trying to sort of pay homage to healthcare workers and get inside of the hospital and show what was happening inside the hospital. But there's obviously a whole nother story happening, in the homes of those of the loved ones of those inside the hospital. And so we began to expand the scope of the storytelling and start to go home with the family members. Because obviously one of the most insidious aspects of COVID was how isolating it was for healthcare workers, how isolating it was for families, making these life or death decisions on iPads and iPhones. And so it's really important to show, all the different lenses through which people were experiencing this pandemic.
It was definitely one of the more emotional aspects that we didn't get to see again on the outside of it. Was we heard the stories of loved ones, saying goodbye over an iPhone or over FaceTime, but we never really got the nurse's perspective of having to do that time and time again over the course of a day.
Yeah.
And it is just so emotionally brutal to realize and empathize with their experience as well. And I think you did a wonderful job of showing that, and that these doctors and nurses trusted you to allow you to cover this and be part of that. Was there something that you found you had to do to earn that trust with them? Did you have to work in with them to get that level?
I mean, trust is sort of the bedrock of every film that I make. The only way to get intimate, observational, sort of verite footage is really developing a trust and a rapport with your subjects. And surely that was the case here. I mean, this was the most difficult moment, in all of our lives, but especially those in front of the camera. And so, we owe so much to them for having the courage to open up. But that that relationship and that trust is something that, like any relationship, a romantic, a professional, a friendship, it's something that you need to consistently renew and check in on and make sure that that you're that they're okay with this process, because it was so difficult and the stakes were so high. And I think one of the more difficult parts of gaining that trust is that we're all masked, and so much of, like, at least the way I connect with people is through gesticulating and face-to-face contact and making eye contact, and sort of when half of your face is covered, it's really hard to connect to strangers that you're meeting for the first time. And so it's really interesting. That's sort of behind the scenes, and then sort of in terms of shooting the film, I was constantly worried. Could we feel the emotion of those who are filming when half of their face was covered? And so it's really important. It's not a sort of accident that so much of the film is in sort of a medium or a close shot, because so much of the emotion of what was happening is playing out in people's eyes. Sorry, I digress there, but that's.
No, not at all. Actually, you're getting into exactly what we should be talking about, which is, photographically how you were able to tell the story. And that was, again, part of the power of this, is that you put us right there, right in the middle of what's happening, whether it's somebody fighting for their life or somebody fighting to save somebody's life. So diverting from the emotional for a minute, let's talk a little bit about the hardware. What did you bring in to shoot this?
So very, very small teams. It was sort of 2-person teams, often filming in sort of 2 different shifts. There are many days when we were shooting 16, 18 hours a day. Sometimes we had crews inside the hospital, crews outside the hospital. We were predominantly shooting on the C300 Mark II and the C500. Really simple kits. I don't like to rig out my cameras, with big fancy primes. We're shooting on zooms, and to me, cameras are just tools, and it's just how you use them. And given again all the sort of complexities of the logistics of making this film, I sort of wanted to keep our packages as small as possible, and and working with as small a footprint as possible. So it's often just one camera in a room at a given time, and the last thing in the world that we wanted to do was obviously infringe upon the healthcare that was being given at the time.
Well, yeah, that becomes a question in my mind logistically. Like, how do you even try to cover an emergency situation when there are 8, 9 medical professionals around a single patient trying to save their life, and you're there as a camera, as an obstruction to that? My head goes into how do we do this? How do we cover this moment and maintain that balance?
That's the sort of journalistic dance that I often find myself walking along in every film that I make. This film especially, almost definitely every single hour, sometimes every single minute, there are extremely complex moral decisions being made. And because we're constantly filming on the razor thin line between life and death. And there's often certain patients that you think would survive that died, and vice versa. And so it was constantly trying to find that balance of being there and experiencing the reality of what was happening, but doing it with integrity and honesty. And part of the way you do that is time. We spent a lot of time. We filmed this over 4 or 5 months, almost every single day, as I said, often in multiple shifts in a certain day. So we really developed a rapport with not just the principal participants in the film, but the hospital system itself. And so by the end of filming, almost every single person in the hospital knew who we were. So we, the goal is to become part of the fabric of the daily life of those who you're filming, and that was definitely the case here. It had to be. Otherwise, we couldn't just roll up in an emergency situation, because everyone would be turning and saying, why are you here? So developing that trust, both on a high level with the hospital administration, but also with all the doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers that we're interacting with.
Yeah. You mentioned how small the team was, and obviously you're in a hospital situation, you're in a COVID situation, you can't have very many people with you. There's a kind of access to authenticity or truth by directing with the camera. Do you find that that's something you prefer to do, that you're directing and shooting at the same time, or do you prefer to work with somebody else where you can see the bigger picture?
I always prefer to shoot myself if I can. And I love shooting, and it sort of eliminates any barrier to achieving what I want. With this film, there's no possible way in which I could shoot it in the hospital. There's just so much going on. And so it was really important to have, DPs that I trusted and that I worked with in the past, and, an amazing group of DPs who worked on this film. Thorsten, Ross, Alex, Brian, they did an incredible job inside the hospital. I filmed outside the hospital a bit more, but it was really important, especially with having multiple DPs working on this film, to have that sort of singular vision and that singular way of shooting. And that came through obviously lots of conversations, and for some of the DPs, I'd worked with them for a long time, so they knew sort of the look and feel that I was trying to achieve. But yeah, I think that both editorially, also working with a team, which I always do, obviously I wanted to constantly have this one singular vision, as opposed to feeling, stylistically different within each scene.
Because you work so closely with this particular team, did that require creating a style sheet or a lookbook or conversations ahead of time? Or was it just really kind of, let's jump and do what we've done before?
For those that I'd worked with in the past, they know every aspect of how I want to shoot. Some of those shooters, I hadn't worked with before. And so, yeah, it required some pretty deep conversations and, coming into shadow for a couple of days to see how we were working. Yeah, I owe so much to them as well. They all did an incredible job in extremely difficult circumstances. Also just cinematically finding the cinema in really badly lit rooms and, really cramped situations. At the end of the day, we sort of had to embrace that. And that was part of what allowed you to, I think, to make you feel like you're there, because there was not a lot of sort of movement and coverage that we could necessarily do within a given room, especially in an emergency situation. And so, yeah, it's constantly trying to find that coverage and that drama, given all the sort of handicaps that we had at the time, people being covered up, terrible lighting, obviously lots of people around and trying to move within them. And then, of course, at the forefront of all that is the respect and deference to those who are filming.
You and your team did that beautifully. It's some of the most beautiful verite kind of footage that I've seen in incredibly garish situations, like talking about. Just straight, flat overhead lighting, but yet there's a beauty in this and in photographing. Yeah, I can say that word. There's a beauty in what you got here that has an elegance to it. There's no question there. I'm just giving you more love.
I appreciate that. And yeah, I owe so much to everyone who worked on this film. Behind the camera, front of the camera, we had an amazing group of producers. And, I think it's interesting. People constantly talk about the sort of bravery of the production team. But, it's as harrowing to be an editor on this film. Because you're living with that footage every single day, and for months and months and months and months and months and months, and reliving it and reliving it and reliving it, and so obviously it was extremely scary and terrifying to shoot, but it was also really hard to cut, because it was inescapable, and it was something that, yeah, my editors and I were living with all the time. And I think, unlike other films that I made in different conflict zones where you could sort of, turn your brain off when you come home, this is something that we were living with 24/7. It was inescapable. We were living the same thing that we're documenting, like everybody else. We didn't come home and put our shoes up and relax. We were washing our hands and scrubbing down our groceries and, taking 30 minutes to get rid of our dirty clothes and stripping in the hallways and, showering for an hour and all the things that honestly it turned out to be sort of a waste of time, because that's not how you really passed on COVID. But at that time, we knew nothing about how it was spread. So we were just trying to follow the science that was available at the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's terrifying to be at ground zero in the middle of what the whole rest of the world is terrified about. And you're right there in the heart of it, really in the worst part of it, where people are, you know, exactly that they're exposed. There's no question that you're around it, and it's right there. There's another aspect of this that I thought was really beautiful, and that's a lot of the B-roll footage that you have, the transitional shots that you have that are they're elegant, they're perfectly timed in the storytelling, and as a filmmaker myself, I'm watching this thinking, did you find these B-roll and these aerials as you were editing? Because they're so perfect in there, or were you actually shooting these at the same time that you were doing the main photography?
It had to be at the same time because, you know, there's a, you know, I knew almost right away that how harrowing the footage that we're shooting was, and that it would be somewhat unsustainable to expect the audiences to be able to, you know, take it for 90 minutes. And so finding ways to create, you know, rhythmic pacing devices where we could, you know, slow down and breathe for a moment. And so really quickly, I knew I wanted to develop sort of the city of New York as a character as much as any of the people in the film, and seeing, especially just looking outside in these empty streets, and seeing the city transform into this almost zombie-like apocalyptic, you know, cityscape. And then over the course of the first wave, really transform. The leaves came out. When George Floyd was killed, obviously the empty streets suddenly were filled with protests. And so we were constantly setting aside time within every week to document the sort of trajectory of how the city looked and felt, because I knew I wanted to use that as a pacing device editorially. And similarly, within the hospital, I wanted to make the sort of organism of the hospital a character as well. And so seeing, for example, the surge unit being built, metaphorically, that just showed obviously how insane this was, and how, you know, the month of April, March was the, you know, highest number of cases. April was the highest number of deaths. As we know, there's sort of a lag between deaths and cases. And so, you know, just seeing seeing the hospital transform with the surge unit, and then later on in June, that surge unit being, you know, shut down. So it was important to me also to document sort of the machinations of the hospital itself, to see that arc over time as well.
There's an interesting thing you brought up too, that as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, there's a massive pivot in this tale as you're documenting all of this COVID and the medical and the patients and the professionals dealing with this. Suddenly there's the death of George Floyd and the massive protests in the wake of that, and you're dropped right in the middle of that and have to pivot and tell that story as well. I hate to throw the question at you, but how was that experience in seeing this happening and realizing I have to cover this too?
Yeah, I mean, we knew we had to cover it before, because again, you didn't need to be a scientist or an epidemiologist to realize that this virus disproportionately affected people of color. And you just needed to walk through the halls of an ICU and look around, and it became very clear. And so it wasn't a question of what, you know, if we were going to touch on that, it was a question of how. And it all just came out naturally through following Dr. Dujay, our principal doctor, you know, who's a first generation American from Haiti. She spoke so vividly about this. And again, it just came out naturally by following her. And similarly, when George Floyd was killed and we had this sort of reckoning over systemic racism in our country, and these empty streets are filled with protest, and people, and thousands of people, you know, we just followed her out onto the streets, and that's naturally where the story took us. And these two things were not, you know, two separate ideas. These are very much interconnected. And so it became just organically part of our film.
we've talked about being able to get firsthand the experiences of the patients and the medical professionals experiencing this, but you and your team are in the middle of that as well. And just by the nature of being there for the time that you are, you become invested in these individuals emotionally and personally. How do you deal with that? How do you balance that connection with the extraordinary tragedy that's happening around you?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm 38 years old. I've been doing this, I don't know, 17 years. I'm not good at math, but since right after college. I'm not sure I've figured that out yet. The way to sort of deal with it all. Yeah, I have nightmares almost every single night. It's something that I struggle with myself. Having made a number of films in difficult situations or different conflict zones, and my father battled cancer for most of my life, and so for me, there's no actually scarier place to go than a hospital. Just literally walking inside the hospital, I had this sort of physical reaction to it, especially in those first couple of weeks. So it was, it was hard, but I think, look, at the end of the day, there's also so much beauty and humanity and love and courage that we witnessed. And that's what I think drove us, every single one of us who worked on this film, to make it. It was deeply inspirational to see really how human beings come together in the face of crisis. And that was something that we witnessed on a daily basis.
Let's circle back a little bit to the tools that you were utilizing for this. You said the C300 Mark II and C500.
Mm-hmm.
Why the choice of those cameras?
I started out on the Canon XL2, and I think I've sort of evolved with the Canon line of verite cameras, and it just, to me, it's just it's a lightweight camera that shoots beautifully cinematic images. And again, I don't view these as, people constantly talk about using fancy primes and the latest and greatest whatever, and for me, again, these are all tools, and it's about using them correctly. It's about approaching your subject. It's about many other things than just fancy toys. And so they're great cameras, they're durable, and I love the look of them. But at the end of the day, the main reason I chose them is because they're what I'm used to working with, and same with the DPs that I worked with on this film.
Yeah, they're definitely, especially for these types of stories and these types of projects, they're workhorse.
We weren't trying to hide. Everyone knew that we were there, and so we weren't like covertly filming with an iPhone. I mean, we wanted our presence known. We wanted people to know that we were filming in this situation. And so, it's just a great camera. I think half of us work with a camera in sort of a, very basic way with no rigging. Thor and Ross, like to rig it out on the shoulder. And that, that's another great thing about the camera is you can use it in different ways. I personally love just using the body itself and basically two lenses. But it's, it's a great camera.
So that puts it just straight in your hands, basically, then, right? Not trying to do a shoulder rig or an easy rig.
Literally out of the box. The only thing I add on is a viewfinder on the LCD screen.
Yeah, that certainly helps, especially when you're working as a one person shooting, to not have to look at that little fold out in front of you.
Well,
Viewfinder.
And most especially, obviously, it helps when you're outside. It's very hard to see it daylight. So
having gone through this whole experience and put this film together and have such a personal connection to this, what do you hope that the audience will take away from seeing this?
I mean, I think, the film is about many things. I hope 100 different people take 100 different things away from it. Obviously, it's about COVID, but it's about family. It's about strangers coming together in the face of crisis. It's about systemic racism. It's about many, many, many different things. And I think obviously COVID is something that's just cataclysmically changed all of our lives. Every single person on this earth has been touched in some way. And, I hope that this film provides a vehicle through which we can reflect on all that we've been through. And what have we learned? What have we learned that we can apply to now? What have we learned that we can apply to the present? And I think it's so easy for us, especially in America, maybe just it's human nature. I don't know if it's an American thing or just basic human nature, but just to want to move on and not look back. And certainly there's, people, even best friends of mine have said, they're nervous about this film. They're scared about watching it. But I think there's a lot of love and humanity in this film. And that's the overwhelming feeling when I look back on the experience of making it and also the film itself. Again, it's about how human beings come together in the face of crisis. And I think that's a really beautiful thing that we can reflect on and also apply going forward.
Well, I said earlier, and it wasn't a flippant comment in any way, shape, or form. I do feel like this should be required viewing for not just people in this country, but for the world, to get a better understanding and connection to the heart of what is happening, what happened in 2020, and what we're all still going through. But at the same time, it's a difficult film to recommend to somebody because it is so emotionally exhausting to watch. But in that same breath, where are we going to be able to see this, and when will the world be able to see this?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't any, it was exhausting and traumatic for those who are on the front lines every single day who are still on the front lines. And so not that it's, I can't say it should be required viewing or not. But I do hope that people do watch it because, I think it's important when we talk about healthcare heroes and people clapping at 7 o'clock, like, what are they clapping for? And do they really understand, what is happening inside those hospitals? And now 2 years later, we're seeing potentially an entire generation of healthcare workers that are leaving the profession, that are deeply traumatized by what they've been through. And, with Omicron right now, it's scary, it's devastating, has massive consequences in almost every aspect of our lives right now. But one of the biggest problems with Omicron is how it's affecting hospital systems and the staffing shortages that we're seeing. And that's a big reason for that. It's just, doctors and nurses and healthcare workers are deeply traumatized by what we've been through. And so I hope that this film on another level is just an homage to them and the work that they are doing, and will continue to do to help us all. Yeah.
Matt, thank you so much for the time today. I appreciate it. And thank you for this film. I do feel like it's one of the more important films to be released recently. And thank you for what you put into this and the work that you continue to do.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And on behalf of American Cinematographer and Canon Creative Studio, we thank you all for watching and being part of the Sundance Film Festival here virtually. I'm Jay Holden, and thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.